draw her to you and heal her directly. Father, we pray for healing, whether it's medically or directly. We pray for Miss Margaret. We continue to ask that you would be with her and watch over her and bring healing to her and others, Father, who are in our church family, who are struggling tonight, who are unhealthy. For Mr. Ralph, we lift him up to you. Father, and there are a host of other people that stand in need. And God, we thank you for James and for his teaching. We pray tonight that you will give us spiritual ears to hear and understand what your word says. And Lord, we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, brother.
Can you hear me? Okay. Tonight we will be in Hebrews 12. So picking up from the Hebrews 12, picking up from the Heroes of Faith. So I'll go ahead and read the chapter. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endureth such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest he be wearied and faint in your minds. Ye have not resisted unto blood, striving against sin, and ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastising of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chastiseth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastising, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chastiseth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then ye are bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastise us after their own pleasure. But he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastising for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Wherefore lift up the hands which hang down, and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, and let it rather be healed. Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord, looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springeth up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled, lest there be any fornicator or profane person, as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. For ye know how that afterward, when he would have inherited the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears. For ye are not come unto the mount that might be touched, and that burned with fire, nor into blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, which voice they that heard entreated that the words should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure that which was commanded, and if so much as a beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned, or thrust through with a dart. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. But ye are come unto Mount Sion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an immeasurable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better things than that of Abel. See that ye refuse him not that speaketh, for if they escape not who refused him that spake on earth, much more shall not we escape. If ye turn away from him that speaketh unto heaven, whose voice then shook the earth, but now he hath promised, saying, Yet once more I will shake not the earth only, but also heaven. And this word, with yet once more, signifieth the removing of those that are shaken, as of things that are made, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Wherefore we receive a kingdom which cannot be moved. Let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. Okay. So to summarize, which I've done every time, the sort of theme for Hebrews, of course, is superior, right? We began with Hebrews 1, that Christ is superior to the angels, and then 2, that Christ is the perfect Son of Man. 3, Christ is superior to Moses. And 4, because Moses was unable to provide the time of rest that was promised, but Christ, being better, was able to give us that rest. Chapter 5, Christ is superior to Aaron. And then in chapter 6, we have the warning passages. And then in 7, how Melchizedek was superior to Levi. And thereby, of course, Christ, being of the order of Melchizedek, is a part of a superior priesthood. And then chapters 8 through 10, we have how the new covenant is superior to the old covenant. In chapter 8, we have Christ as high priest is qualified to offer a better covenant. And then in chapter 9, the services that are provided by the new covenant are superior to the ones of the old. Then chapter 10, how Christ is a superior sacrifice to the sacrifices of the old covenant. And then in chapter 11, we have the heroes of the faith passage. So now we have chapter 11, which is after, if you may wonder, why did we go from heroes of faith to chapter 12? Well, because the point is in chapter 12 how Christ is superior to the heroes of the faith. So beginning in verse 1, we have, therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us. This is very reminiscent of Paul. Paul loves his athletic metaphors. He loves his running metaphors and other sporting events metaphors. He's not the only one to use them, but he's probably more famous. Probably one of the more popular examples is in 2 Timothy 4:7. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. There is reserved for me in the future the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me on that day, and not only to me, but all those who love his appearing. So we have this reference to the great cloud of witnesses. And the commentaries all agree that there are basically two ways to interpret the role of these witnesses. And of course, the witnesses are the holy ones who have come before. So picturing, right, the metaphor that is built is that we are runners in like an Olympic stadium, right? There's a sporting event and we're all running. The running, of course, is the metaphor for our spiritual walk. And then we have these witnesses. So the question is, the witnesses, of course, are those who came before. They're the holy ones. These include the heroes mentioned in chapter 11. So the question is, are they previous runners who are no longer on the field and are now sitting in the stands, now watching us run? Right, so they're the witnesses, they're spectators watching us. Or are they runners who are further down the lane? So we're all running like in a big marathon, and some have gone before us, and we are still running the race with them, but they're so far ahead that they can't really see us, but we can see them, and we should be encouraged by the fact that they're ahead of us and that we're not running by ourselves. Right? This is not a solo endeavor. We're all part of the same race, but some are just ahead of us, and the fact that we see them ahead of us should be encouraging to us that we're not alone. The main takeaway is, are these witnesses watching us run, or are we watching them run? That's a very important distinction. All the commentaries I looked at are by Protestants, and they all, of course, go with the second option. My assumption is a Catholic interpretation would say that they're watching us run, that they're the holy ones in heaven, that they've completed their race, and now they get to, they're sitting back in heaven, cheering us on, watching us. Again, because all the commentators looked at were for Protestants, they all go, no, that's not right. They're not. There's no stands in heaven where they can just look down on earth and watch what's going on earth. It sounds good. The image looks really well, because you can picture the stadium, right? And you can picture all the previous runners up in the stands watching us and cheering us on. I don't know why the metaphor doesn't work necessarily, but again, the common interpretation, especially for Protestants, is that these are referring to people who are still running, but they're ahead of us in some sense. He, of course, goes on to mention that we should lay aside every weight and the sin that ensnares us. He makes a distinction, right, between weight and the ensnaring. Weights can be anything that would hold us back. One commentary pointed out, I think this was a really interesting thing to point out. Of course, we're going to talk about Olympics and exercising and all that good stuff because there's such a prominent metaphor in this chapter. But one commentary pointed out that in the Greek games, they participated naked. Right? They wore nothing. It was just them and their birthday suit because nothing could hold them back. Nothing prevented them from participating. They didn't even wear clothes. In fact, there's some thinking that at the beginning, there was some sort of ceremony where you disrobed, because when you competed, you couldn't have anything on, nothing to help you, nothing to hurt you. It was just you again in your body. And he argued that that's what the author of Hebrews might be thinking about. So when he says, you participate being completely unencumbered, he's thinking in terms of like the naked Olympians. I don't know, but it sounds good. Then in verse 2, he goes on, keeping our eyes on Jesus. So, and where he's going to keep going on is that if it's true that we're in the race, and it's more like a marathon, and there's people in front of us, people behind us, and we are to take encouragement in the fact that we're not participating by ourselves, but that we're participating with all of these others, which would include the heroes of the faith, correct? He goes, then he clarifies, we're not concerned with what everyone else is doing. Our eyes aren't on anybody else. We need to be focused on Christ. He's the goal. The picture in my mind I just can't get out of is I've never really followed sporting events. I just don't care. I am a fair weather Rangers fan. When the Rangers do well, I like to cheer them on. And when they just inevitably screw up, I give up on them. I don't care about the Cowboys. I don't care about football, basketball, anything. However, there was one brief moment. Well, I liked the Rangers when they were winning, and then they screwed up in the series, and I gave up on them. I've dusted the sand off my hands and my feet and just turned my back on them. But there was a time in my life when I was interested in athletics, the Olympics. So in 2008, right, the China Olympics. And in particular, we had a swimmer who made the audacious claim that he was going to win 8 golds. That was Michael Phelps, something that had never been done before and probably will never be done again. One of the most impressive feats of human endurance, possibly in world history. It was incredible. I watched those events. I watched Michael Phelps. I wanted to see, could he pull off 8 golds? And he did. It was incredible. But I don't think it was at these games necessarily, but there's an image, a very famous picture of Michael Phelps. You've probably seen it at some point. Now, I assume most of you know the name Michael Phelps, or at least you should. He's one of the greatest swimmers of all time, one of the most heavily decorated Olympians of all time. But there's a South African swimmer who's fairly renowned, but not nearly to the level of Michael Phelps. His name is Chad Leclos. I don't know how to pronounce it. None of you know his name, right? There's a very famous picture of him. You've probably seen the picture. It's a brilliant picture. It's a picture of Phelps in one of his relays. I don't think it's at the China Games. I think it was taken right before. But Phelps is swimming, and Chad, the South African swimmer, is in the next lane to him. And the picture is Chad. He's rising above the water, and you can see him, and his eyes are straight ahead. Right? Nothing is deviating his vision. And right next to him, right, Chad, and they're both completely in frame. You see Chad, he's also rising above the water, right? And Chad, however, his head's turned to the left. He's looking at Michael. He's not looking ahead. And commentaries even say that was the moment he lost the race, because he took his eyes off the goal. He was more concerned with what Michael was doing than where the goal was. It's a great picture. And so when I read this verse, that's all I could think of was that picture of Chad looking at Michael and Michael looking straight ahead. So he goes on, the source and perfecter of our faith. You've probably heard, explanations of this. Source, of course, is the idea of originator or the beginning. It's archon in Greek, not that it really means anything. And then, of course, perfecter is the telos word, so the one who completes it. So Christ, who is both the beginning of our faith, the source of our faith, however you want to phrase it, as well as the one who finishes, completes it, has made it perfect. And then he goes on, who, for the joy that lay before him, endured a cross and despised the shame and has sat down at the right hand of God's throne. So again, notice there's no mention of the other competitors. There's no mention of the other runners. The only one that we're supposed to be concerned about is Christ. He's the one that matters. He is the one we're supposed to be thinking on, we're supposed to be focused on, and he is the standard. He's the goal. We're not worried about anybody else. We're worried about reaching Christ, who is the goal. And then in verse 3, for consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, so that you won't grow weary and lose heart. So it's this rather simple. As we go through our race, we need to reflect on Christ. And as bad as it gets in our life, we need to remember we don't have it as bad as Christ had it. That's not always the most comforting thing to think about. Oh, you think you've got it bad. Well, think about what I had to do, blah, blah, blah. But that is what he's saying, right? As bad as you might have it, it's not as bad as what Christ had to go through. And again, he's pointing out what Christ had to endure, not the other heroes of faith. He doesn't say, as bad as your life may be, whatever you have to endure, it's not as bad as God's not going to make you live for a year by a brook eating bird droppings. He could have said that. He's not going to, and you're like wondering, yes, that happened. That happened to one of the prophets. Look it up. He's not going to make you, endure whatever Moses endured or whatever the disciples had to endure. You'll have your own trials and tribulations to endure, which is just fun to think about. So then in verse 4, in struggling against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Again, as bad as you have it, it's not as bad as Christ, which is not always the most comforting thing to think about. So there's a story in Maccabees that, for some reason, is just ingrained in my soul, and I will never get rid of it. And it's the story, I often wonder if this was in part the inspiration for Saving Private Ryan. There's the story of the 7 brothers who are captured by the Greeks, and one by one they're brought forth to some sort of trial or whatever, and they're told, you have to renounce Yahweh, and of course, one by one they don't. In each one they kill in succession, and they get to the final son, they're like, look, all your brothers are dead, you're the last one, just renounce Yahweh, we'll let you go, we don't want to kill all of you, and the son says, no, I won't renounce Yahweh, and then they kill the son. So all 7 brothers are killed. And then it gets to their mother, and their mother goes to the high priest, and the mother is just beside herself. She's lost all 7 sons. And the high priest does exactly what pastors should never do. He starts to scold the woman, and he says, you think you have it bad. And she's like, I think I've got it pretty bad. I just lost all 7 of my sons. And the pastor goes, what you have endured is nothing compared to what God is enduring. That's what he tells her. And he sends her on her way. So I wouldn't necessarily use that as a way of encouragement, but it's an interesting story. And then he goes on in verse 5. And you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons. So then he does somewhat of a quotation of Proverbs 3:11-12. My son, do not take the Lord's discipline lightly, or faint when you are reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and punishes every son he receives. Again, this is a loose translation of Proverbs 3:11-12. In our translations, it's something more like, do not despise the Lord's instructions, my son, and do not loathe his discipline. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, just as the Father, the Son he delights in. It's similar enough. But, so he goes on. So we'll cover this, because this is going to be kind of the focus of the next couple of verses. So he begins at verse 7. Endure suffering as discipline. And this is very reminiscent of a couple of passages in the New Testament, but for me, it's closest to James 1. So consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But endurance must do its complete work, so that you must be mature and complete, lacking nothing. So the idea is suffering is going to come. You should look forward to suffering. You should embrace the suffering, because the suffering produces discipline and endurance. Now, there are 2 things to keep in mind. One, not all suffering is from God. Sometimes you suffer because you screwed up and you deserve to suffer. Second, God could, of course, be punishing you. Not necessarily for your own good, just you did something wrong and God's going to punish you. Not everything is a lesson. I just had a thought. I was never a big fan of The Office, but there's some really poignant scenes, and one is when the intern, I can't remember his name, he does something wrong, and he goes to one of the older employees, and he's like, I don't understand what I did wrong. I think it's Rainn Wilson. I think it's the Rainn Wilson character. And he looks at him and goes, you just screwed up. Not everything's a lesson. Sometimes you just fail. And that's something to keep in mind, right? Sometimes, you just fail. The point is, just because you're suffering that doesn't make you a martyr. And we need to keep that in mind. So sometimes we suffer because it's our own fault. Sometimes we suffer because we're being punished. But some of the times, maybe most of the time, God is sending us stuff to make us, to discipline us, and to help us grow, to help us get stronger. And then interestingly, he links this idea that God disciplines us with the treatment of sons. So he goes on, God is dealing with you as sons. We can expand this to children, sons and daughters. So we've already had that discussion earlier in the text, how we have now been embraced as the heirs and the children of God and so on. But now he's linking the idea that God is intentionally disciplining us with our status as his children, and he's going to build on that. He goes on and say, for what son is there that a father does not discipline? The answer is a bad one, right? And he's going to build on that. There's a really, it's interesting that this is still somewhat ingrained in our culture. The clearest example I can think of, just from my own pop culture references, is there was a sitcom, Malcolm in the Middle. I don't know how many of you are aware of it or no, but it's just a family sitcom. And it's a fairly, well, I say a fairly typical family, but I don't know what that means anymore in America. But you've got the parents, and then you've got these 3 children that live in the house, and they're just incredibly rambunctious. They're completely disobedient, and they are just crazy monsters. And there's one episode in particular where I believe it's the middle son has driven his mother to the point where she literally just goes crazy and she snaps. And you see this in other sitcoms as well. And it's an interesting motif where the mother finally goes, I don't care. Just do what you want. And usually the common trope is the kid, instead of being overjoyed, right, they think that that's what they want, they realize something has gone wrong. Right? This is not the way it's supposed to be. The parent has just gone from exasperated to full-on apathy. Just do whatever. Because the kid wants discipline. The kid wants boundaries. The kid wants to know what is right and what is wrong, because the kid wants to cross those boundaries. If there are no boundaries, then there's nothing to cross. There's nothing to rebel against. Kids want boundaries because they want to rebel. If there are no boundaries, you can't rebel. It's as simple as that. So the main point is there is still this idea in our culture that not having boundaries is a bad thing, which is interesting, I think. And again, going here, that part of the role of parents is establishing these boundaries, disciplining your children. And he goes on, because he's going to build on this, right? But if you were without discipline, which all receive, then you are illegitimate children and not sons or sons and daughters. So he now makes an interesting connection, which is if your parents didn't discipline you, then your parents aren't acting as parents, right? They're essentially they're not functioning as parents. They're not your parents in a practical sense. So I'm going to go off on a slight mild tangent. I'm sure that if I were to bring up what is wrong with America today, you would all have your opinions, and we don't need to open that up. I'm the one with the microphone. But I've heard an explanation, and it's one of the best I've ever heard, and I've never heard it repeated from anywhere else. It was from a professor at Criswell, and I thought it was one of the most profound answers I'd ever heard. And he said, where America really went wrong can be pinpointed to a very specific moment in a very specific year. And that year is 1946. The event was the publishing of a book, one of the most important books ever published in America, Dr. Spock. Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Caring. Because what did you do before Dr. Spock? You just did what your parents did, and they did what their parents did. And it was all passed down through tradition, right? But now you had Dr. Spock. Now you had a book. You had the experts telling you how to raise your kids. And there were a lot of interesting things in this book, such as don't spank your kids, don't discipline your kids, and all this sort of stuff. And Dr. Spock started a whole revolutionizing movement in how to raise kids, but not only that, but also the science in child rearing. I'm not saying he started that, but he kind of started that movement on a pop cultural level. And again, one of the most famous things that come out of this was not disciplining your kids, which the author of Hebrews says, if your parents don't discipline you, then they're essentially not your parents, right? They're not functioning as your parents. Something has gone seriously wrong. We'll keep going on this, right? So in verse 9, furthermore, we had natural fathers discipline us, and we respected them. This is probably the single biggest cultural disconnect between where we are today and where he was 2,000 years ago. Do we really respect our parents? I know you're all older, and you're like, of course I did. I have my doubts, but whatever you want to say, I'm not going to challenge it. But from what I've seen, we very rarely respect our parents. My generation probably doesn't. From what I can tell, my parents' generation didn't really. I'm not really sure about my grandparents. But, of course, this is ingrained in the 10 Commandments. Number 5, right? Honor your father and your mother. And, of course, that commandment isn't just aimed at parents. There's a reason. I'm teaching a class on Deuteronomy, and I believe that this is the stipulation that establishes the rules regarding laws of the elders, laws of the authority in the culture. You have judges, you have kings, you have prophets, you have priests, and there are laws regarding, you have to listen to them, right? They're put in power over you, and you have to respect them just as you respect your parents. And it all begins at home. That's why the home is the most important unit in society. You are ingrained, the home is a very small microcosm of the culture, of the community. A city, which is sort of a nexus, is made up of families, and a country is made up of cities. But if the family unit breaks down, then you can't really have a city. You can't have a larger community. And if you don't have communities, you don't have a country. Get to more on this. In Proverbs 22:6, which is a very famous verse that is always mistranslated, I'm just going to throw that out there. The way that you've always heard this translated is, train up a child in the way that he should go. There's a problem with that. There is no conditional clause in that verse. There is no word for should in that verse. That should terrify you. The way it should be translated would be something more like, a very awkward way, would be something like, dedicate the child on the way of his going. For when he is old, he will not swerve. What that means is, the picture, which the Hebrew is awkward, but it's also very explicit. The idea is, when the child is young, you set them in a direction. And once they start on that direction, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep going in that direction. So we add the condition, right, on the way he should go, because that sounds better. But the idea is, if you set the child on the wrong path early on, it doesn't stop, it keeps going. So I think it's true. We don't respect our parents the way we should, the way the Bible asks us to, but I'll say culturally, I'm not attacking anyone directly. If you feel attacked, that's on you, it's not on me. But to be fair, do we take our role as parents seriously enough? I think it's a fair question. I get it. I don't have kids, and I'm speaking purely from an academic perspective, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But he goes on, and he says, shouldn't we submit even more to the Father of spirits and live? I remember it was probably my grandmother who first connected the idea of the respect we have towards our Father is sort of a reflection of our respect for God. And sure, I've heard others say that as well, and the author here seems to be making a connection between how we respect our parents as a reflection of how we respect God. I think Deuteronomy does the same thing. Then in verse 10, for they disciplined us for a short time based on what seemed good to them. This is rather straightforward, but I think the idea is still profound. The reason why you should discipline your kid is because you want your kid to turn out like you. we have allowed this idea to become ingrained in our culture that kids will find their own way. The culture will raise our kids. The public education will raise our kids. TV will raise our kids. And then we wonder why they turned out the way that they do. Again, I'm speaking academically. I don't have kids. So, but this idea that has kind of festered in our culture is pretty much all just made up after World War II. This just isn't the way humanity operated prior to the 20th century. And to not go too far on a crazy, wild tangent, but there are reasons why there are forces in our culture that target children's education. Because they know that if they can get to your kids when they're young, they can put ideas in their head that will manifest when they're older that you won't be able to get out of their heads. And that's why we should take educating our children and take, especially young children, very, very seriously. I don't like public education, by the way. So, we'll go on. But he does it for our benefit so that he can share his holiness. So God does the same reason. He disciplines, just as our parents are supposed to discipline us so that we turn out like them, God disciplines us so that we turn out like him. He wants us to be endowed with his holiness. Again, I'm teaching a class on Deuteronomy, and something that comes up so often in the student that I have in the class, even he started to notice how many times in Deuteronomy it says, teach your kids, instruct your kids, remind them of what has happened. Because, right, and I use the quote because it's a great quote, but of course he's referring to communism and Marxism. But there's a quote by Ronald Reagan who says, freedom's only one generation away. He's talking about communism and Marxism. I get that. But I think that this sentiment holds true for what's going on in Deuteronomy. Moses is telling the people, like, okay, look, I'm not going into the land with you. I'm going to be killed off with this past generation. You are going to go in, without me, without your fathers, and you have to keep things going. You have to teach your kids. Because all it takes is one generation. All it takes is one generation to not know Yahweh, and everything goes off a cliff. Now, that generation who knew Moses, led by Joshua, they took the land. Everything comes out fairly well until you get to Judges. And then you hit generations that don't know Joshua, they don't know Moses, they don't know Yahweh, and everything turns out really, really bad, which is exactly what Moses warned them against. So, here we have Yahweh disciplining his children so that they will adapt to his holiness or become like him. So then in verse 11, no discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. He doesn't come out and say it, but I feel like what is not said is we are supposed to rejoice in our suffering, and this is something I am very bad at. I don't really know anybody that's good at it. This is reminiscent of like 1 Peter 4:16, but if anyone suffers as a Christian, he should not be ashamed but should glorify God in having that name. So the idea that we should, again, rejoice in our suffering. We're not good at it, but we're supposed to do it anyway. Later on, however, it yields the fruit of peace and righteousness to those who have been trained by it. This idea of we are growing, we are like trees, and we produce fruits of righteousness, and so on and so forth. This is a fairly common metaphor in the Old Testament. Probably one of the more famous examples is from Psalm 1 that goes, how happy, fortunate is the man who does not follow the advice of the wicked or take the path of sinners or join the group of mockers. Instead, his delight, that's a fun word, is in the Lord's instruction, and he meditates on it day and night. Meditate's also a fun word. He is like a tree planted beside streams of water that bears its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. So again, the metaphor that you are planted, that you're planted like a tree. The tree doesn't move. The tree is just a tree. The tree is cared for by the wind and by the water, which here, of course, is supposed to be God's nourishment. And then in time, the tree produces fruit. Right? So he goes on in verse 12, therefore, strengthen your tired hands and weakened knees. Seems to be just a fairly broad encouragement, just to keep going, don't don't let your tiredness hold you back. And then in verse 13, make straight paths for your feet so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but heal instead. This could use a little clarification. Again, we're fully back to the marathon metaphor. And the idea seems to be just keep running straight. Don't veer off. Don't try to take shortcuts. Don't do anything that would unnecessarily put you in danger or risk of harm. Just keep running ahead. Right? And then verse 14, pursue peace with everyone and holiness. Without it, no one will see the Lord. The peace here probably refers to peace within the Christian community, not necessarily, try to be peaceable with everyone. When you have groups outside that are actively trying to hurt the community or whatever, just make peace to make peace kind of idea. This is, again, probably referring to the Christian community. And it's an exhortation that we are all working together. We're all part of the same race. This probably holds a lot of relevance for us because, thinking about this in first century Christianity, you have the various sects, as we're told. You have the Paul sect, and you have the Peter sect, and you've got all these groups, and they're, the idea that the early church was completely unified is a bit of a fairy tale, but we are certainly far more divided now than we were then. And we've got all the different denominations and creeds and whatnot, and the idea is we are still part of the one church, right? And we need to work together at times to further the interests of the church and not get too caught up in our squabbling. That said, I realize we've got a lot of crazy denominations that are all doing some really crazy things, and we have to pick our friends carefully, but at the same time remember that we are all part of the same race. So then verse 15, make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God and that no root of bitterness springs up, causing trouble and by it defiling many. Again, pretty straightforward, but the idea that bitterness, resentment can ruin the church body, I think that's pretty straightforward. And then we get to a really interesting section. So the author of Hebrews is going to really turn Esau into a punching bag. And we're going to have to talk about this. So in verse 16, he goes, and make sure that there isn't any immoral or irreverent person like Esau. So where is he getting this from? Esau was an immoral person? What does that mean? He's probably referring to the idea that, my heart goes out for Esau. He's such a punching bag, and I'm not sure he completely deserves it. And have kind of continued the tradition of turning him into a real punching bag. But you have the point. So Esau took a local girl that is a non-Hebrew for a wife. And then after Jacob had tricked Esau, then Rebekah, right, who's kind of siding with Jacob in the whole rivalry, she tells Isaac and Esau that she sent Jacob to go to Laban so that he can marry someone of the family, because she doesn't want her kids marrying local girls. Well, then we find out that Esau had married a local girl. And Esau, it says Esau in his sadness went and married another local girl. It's like, it sounds almost like he didn't know that it was a problem to marry one of the local girls. And then because, he wasn't good enough to go marry one of the family. He wasn't good enough to go to Laban and marry one of his cousins, which I know sounds awkward as I say it, but it's the Bible. And then in his grief, he marries another local girl, probably to hurt his mom. It's like, I wasn't good enough for you, so I'll just go marry another local girl. But you do have in Jewish tradition this idea that because he was marrying local girls and he didn't do what Jacob did and go marry one of Laban's daughters, that this means he was involved in immorality. It's not actually in the Old Testament, but that's where they're getting it from. And then he goes on to say, who sold his birthright in exchange for one meal. Again, I just feel sorry for Esau. I can't help it. We should all know the story of Esau, right? So Esau was Isaac's favorite son. Esau was the hunter. He was the man's man, gruff, and the woodsman, the outdoorsman. And he went hunting one day, and he didn't catch any food. He's really hungry. There have been various medical justifications, like he's hypoglycemic or diabetic or something. I have no idea. The Bible doesn't say. The Bible gives us no indication of this. Regardless, he is very hungry. He is very tired. And then he comes into this clearing, and there's Jacob making stew. He's like, hey, Jacob, give me some stew. And Jacob's like, give me your birthright. And we always, kind of dogpile on Esau, like, why would you sell your birthright? Like, the guy was hungry. I don't know what he was thinking. We never condemned Jacob. Like, why not? What is so bad about giving your brother some food? It's like, it's always on Esau. Like, how dare you, Esau? But I am not contradicting the author of Hebrews. I don't fully understand the why we're some of the animosity towards Esau. But regardless, he goes on in 17, for you know that later, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected because he didn't find any opportunity for repentance, though he sought it with tears. This is not in the Old Testament. There's no indication that he, begged for his birthright back or that he cried about it, or he was obviously mad. And ultimately, he's tricked out of the blessing. Like, he didn't sell the blessing, he sold the birthright. So the author of Hebrews is probably getting a lot of this from Jewish tradition, and that had been developing over the intertestamental period. And he's really doing this to push a theological point more than just retelling the story. But still, I feel bad for Esau. And just to kind of hammer the point, I was in a... I try not to do this. I try to exercise humility. It doesn't always come out. I apologize. I won't necessarily do any better, but I will apologize for it. So I was in an audience listening to a sermon. It was from a pastor that I didn't necessarily like or respect, which is why I felt empowered to do this. And at one point, he made this comment about how God doesn't hate anybody, and I yelled out, "What about Esau?" And the pastor just kind of froze for a second, and they just went on. He didn't, like he pretended to ignore what I just said. So, of course, we have Malachi 1:2, where it's famously states, I loved Jacob, or Jacob I loved, and Esau I hated. So we've got those words. And in all fairness, those are not the best way to translate those words. It's ahav and shana, which are almost always translated as love and hate. Ahav probably means something more like to devote yourself to or to dedicate yourself to, whereas shana is more like reject or to cast away. So you could translate this as more like Esau I chose and Jacob I chose, Esau I rejected, and that would probably work a little bit better. But we almost universally translate this as love and hate. The words in Hebrew probably don't evoke the deep emotional connotation that our words for love and hate have, but in the words of Tevye, tradition. So then in verse 18, for you have not come. Because commentaries and theologians love to use big words to sound really smart, I'll parrot that. The word that kept getting used over and over again is proleptic, and that means ongoing. So when he says this, he doesn't mean you have come in the sense you've already finished your race, because you obviously haven't. You're still alive, you're still running, you're still competing. So the idea is you are ongoing. Your coming is ongoing. Or you could maybe say that when your coming has finished, but it's awkward. Anyway, so for you have come, or you have not come, to what could be touched. This is really awkward. Even in the Greek, it's awkward. To what could be touched, to a blazing fire, to darkness, to gloom and storm, to the blast of the trumpet and the sounds of words. Those who heard it begged that not another word be spoken to them. So he's obviously summarizing when the Hebrews got to Sinai, right? So when the Hebrews, we'll say, finished their race, right? They got out of Egypt, they went through the initial leg of the desert, and they came to the mountain of Sinai, and when they got there, the mountain's on fire, there's darkness, there's the trumpets, there's the thunder and all that stuff, and what happens? They are terrified. They are beside themselves. And he's like, that's not where you've arrived, and that's not where you're going to arrive. That's not the same thing. It goes on in verse 20. For they could not bear what was commanded, and even if an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned. This is awkward to me because he goes, you didn't come to the mountain, the physical mountain, the one you could touch, that couldn't be touched. I feel like that could have been worded a little differently or a little better. But again, the idea is you didn't come to the physical mountain with all these things going on that were so intense that the people didn't even want to go to the mountain, and even if they did go on the mountain, they would have died for it. And then 21, the appearance was so terrifying that Moses said, I am terrified and trembling. So it was so bad that even Moses wasn't thrilled. And then 22, instead you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels and festive gathering. And obviously, because the word of the book is superior, you have come to a superior mountain, or rather, you are arriving. You will arrive at something superior, something better. Not Mount Sinai, which is on fire and all that, but rather to Zion, which Zion is going to have, because he's made this entire loop, right? And now we're back to the metaphor. So when we finish our race, when that happens, the end line, the goal line, the finish line, is going to be Zion, which is heavenly Jerusalem. And there will be crowds and cheering the angels and so on. And he goes on to the assembly of the firstborn, whose names have been written in heaven, to God, who is the judge of all, to the spirits of righteous people made perfect. So when we get there, there's going to be all these people, and it's going to be big, this grand event. As far as I can tell, there's nothing quite, the picture in my mind, although when I looked, it's not really true to the ancient culture, but the picture I had in my mind was when they run in the Olympic torch, to start the games. You have the one runner who comes into the stadium, and then you got all these people, right, and they go crazy. And then they make the loop, and then they go to the fire, and they light it, and then that's when the games begin. As far as I can tell, that there was no really opening ceremony to the old Olympic Games, but I feel like the image is similar to what is being depicted here. So then in 24, to Jesus, mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which says better things than the blood of Abel. This is interesting that all of a sudden, it seems almost out of nowhere, he is now connecting the blood of Abel to the blood of Christ. The connection makes sense, right? Because we've already talked about Abel as the first prophet. And he's essentially connecting, so he's saying that Jesus, right, is the mediator of the new covenant, the superior covenant. He doesn't mention Moses, but that's implied. But then he also goes to the sprinkling of blood. And by blood, we mean Jesus' blood as opposed to Abel's blood. So what's the connection? So, of course, Abel was killed by his brother Cain. And we've already established Abel as the first prophet. And he's basically implying, from what I can tell, he's implying that Abel was the first sacrifice. Again, you got to go with it. So Abel was the first sacrifice, which didn't really accomplish anything, right? Whereas Christ is now the final sacrifice that did everything. So then in 25, make sure that you do not reject the one who speaks. This has to be God. It just, nothing else really fits. Nothing else quite makes sense. And then he goes on, for they did not escape when they rejected him who warned them on earth. The him, again, has to be God. And this has to be a reference to the Old Covenant. So when you go, well, does God send people to hell? The answer is yes. So you had people in the Old Testament, when the Old Covenant was given. They didn't listen to God, they didn't follow his commandments, and there was judgment. And he's already made this point earlier, but the idea is if they were unable to escape the judgment of the Old Covenant, what do you think is going to happen to the New Covenant? So he goes on, even less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven. So the idea is, right, if you couldn't escape the judgment of the Old Covenant given at Sinai by God, then why do you think you would escape the judgment of the New Covenant, which has been given to us by Jesus, who's currently in heaven? The answer is you wouldn't. So then he goes on, his voice shook the earth at that time, again, reference to Sinai with all the earthquakes and the thunder and so forth. But now he has promised once more, I will shake not only the earth, but also heaven. This seems to be a pretty overt reference to Haggai 2:6, where it says, for the Lord of hosts says this, once more in a little while, I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth, the sea, and the dry land. So he's going to shake the earth again, like at Sinai, but not just Sinai, right, the whole earth. But this shaking is also going to be reflected in heaven. So this is going to be a complete, everything's going to be turned over, essentially. So then 27. This expression, yet once more, indicates the removal of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what is not shaken might remain. This is a really, logically awkward. But he's basically saying everything is going to be shaken, and a lot is going to be destroyed. We already know there's going to be a new earth. There's going to be a new heaven. And what is replaced, right, is going to be replaced with something that can't be shaken, something eternal, something that will endure. So then in 28. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, so the new kingdom that is established is going to be shake-proof. There's not going to be any more destruction. There's not going to be any more upheaval. It's going to be the eternal kingdom. And then he goes on, let us hold on to grace. By it we may serve God acceptably with reverence and awe. This is really fun because I'm obsessed with the language of fear. And here we do not have the word fear, despite what some of your translations may say. We have, in Greek, we have the word eulobeia, which is the word for reverence or piety. That's, my translation has reverence. And then we have one of the only occurrences of the word doulos. And not doulos in the sense of servant, but doulos, it's doulos and it's connected to deus, and it's the word for dread. This is a very common word in Greek literature to refer to this overwhelming sense of dread as evoked by the pagan gods. This word is never used in the Septuagint, almost as if the Hebrews were afraid to use it because they didn't want their idea of fear to be confused with the pagan Greek idea of fear, which is a really interesting thing to think about. In fact, one of the very few times that we ever see this deus word used is in Maccabees, actually. There's a really great, when Maccabeus, one of his prayers, the Greeks are coming, he's praying to Yahweh, and he's basically asking Yahweh to just wipe out the Greeks. And at the end, he says to Yahweh, show them the meaning of your deus. It's one of the only times I've ever seen this word used in in Hebrew literature. And of course, the pagan Greeks would know what that word means. And again, this is a word that's the Hebrews seem to be very hesitant to ever use. And here, Maccabeus is praying for it. So we have the only time it's ever used in the New Testament with eulobeia. So we have reverence with this very intense type of dread. So he is connecting the two. I would not translate this as godly fear because I see these as opposites, more as parallel. But then he follows this up with, for our God is a consuming fire, which is a really odd thing to end the section with because there's no clarification, there's no context to follow this up with. This is used a few times in Torah. One of the more famous ones is in Deuteronomy 4. So just to give the context, Moses writes, the Lord was angry with me on your account. So this is part of his historical sort of overview. And it's funny because he doesn't say, the Lord was angry with me because I screwed up. No. He goes, he was mad at me because you guys made me screw up. It's Moses. He swore that I would not cross the Jordan and enter the good land the Lord, your God, is giving you as an inheritance, right? I don't get to go because you guys did something wrong. Yeah, Moses enjoys passing the blame. He does it his whole life. I won't be crossing the Jordan because I am going to die in this land. But you are about to cross over and take possession of the land. Be careful not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God that he made with you, and make an idol for yourselves in shape of anything he has forbidden you, for the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. So he is connecting this to the idea of judgment, right? If you screw up, there will be penalties. There will be punishments. How do I know? Because I don't get to go into the land. I'm saying firsthand, I know there is punishment. And there's not always a lesson involved. It's just you screw up and then God will hold you accountable. So you have to keep that in mind. And that's it for chapter 12.
Thank you very much. I forgot to say this at the beginning. We prayed for the Gamies this morning for former church member, he did not get the liver. This is like Nina updated him. It's like the 7th time he's went, and they said, it's not viable. So they're I know y'all don't know these people, but they could really use your prayers. They are a good family. But anyway, let me ask you a question since we talked about questions. Could the cloud of witnesses refer back to chapter 11, to the ones he lists in the Hall of Faith who were faithful? Okay. I was thinking about that. As I was thinking about it, I must have missed when you said that. So anyway. They're all holy ones that are for us. Amen. All right.